to receive a report regarding San Bernardino County Fire Protection District financing. Chief Hartwig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item is twofold. It invites the chief. I've asked the chief, who is now, incidentally, the president of Cal Chiefs, the statewide organization. Congratulations. I've asked the chief to come this morning and talk to the board a bit about the underlying and historic financing for the fire district. The board will likely recall that as part of our 17-18 budget, the board had some very specific direction regarding programs and services that you wanted to see maintained by the fire district. This is not the first board to take that position. Going back several years, the board has, on an incremental basis, allocated and authorized funding for specific programs and services within the fire district. Over the course of time, this has grown to the level that the board approved for the current fiscal year, which is just over almost $26 million. So we're going to talk to you. The chief is going to present to you some perspective about that funding and about how that gap, which is the gap between the district revenue and the service cost currently, is anticipated to evolve over the next several years. And I am hoping that at the end of that presentation, the board may have some direction for us if there are any particular options or combinations of options you would like for us to research and pursue. And I bring this to you now in advance of next year's budget planning, so that as we approach next year's budget planning season, which is only a few months off, that we will be able to have some board guidance in that process. The other two recommendations are action items related to a memorandum of understanding that would be the first of its kind between the county and the fire district, and you sitting as the board of both of those entities, to approve a memorandum of understanding which articulates specifically how the $25.8 million that has been approved in for this year's budget will be utilized. And with that, I would like to invite the chief to make his presentation.
Chief Hartwig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Smith, if I could, before I start, I just wanted to, as maybe a point of privilege, just share a little bit about Las Vegas and the events there and how we impacted, or how they impacted us specifically in the fire district, and how we offered our support. We currently have a mutual aid agreement with Clark County. They're a neighbor, which is interesting. We rely on their services on the transportation corridor especially, and then they rely on our services. So we immediately sent an assistant chief to the incident, checked in with the ICP, and offered our mutual aid services, fire, rescue, and EMS services. Then we immediately started to attend to the impacted employees and families. We have one specific employee. He's a hand crew member of our camp who, along with many first responders that were off duty at the incident, started tending to those that were wounded, and in the process of doing that, he himself was shot. He was stopping the bleeding, and in fact providing CPR to a concert goer that had ultimately suffered a mortal wound, and he was shot. He is out of surgery, and he's expected to make full recovery, and then, of course, some other family members who were impacted as well, and they're recovering after surgery. So thank you for the board and the support that we have to continue to work with our neighbors, Clark County being one of them, and I wanted to make sure I filled you in on that. As Ms. Smith said, this has really been precipitated by what we have placed before you, which is an MOU. Really, the MOU is a document that says, in exchange for this money, the money that you provide the fire district, these are the services that you can expect from us. Very similar to the contracts or MOUs that we have with other cities and districts throughout the county. Real quickly before we get into, I think it'll frame our financial picture better, but as we get into it, we're up to just under $250 million in our budget this year. We have over 1,000 full-time employees. We cover 19,000 of the over 20,000 square miles of the county. The county fire district does. We serve over half the population of the county in unincorporated communities. We also serve a number of cities and towns as part of the fire district. As you see, in addition to the cities that we serve as part of the fire district, Grand Terrace, Needles, San Bernardino, Upland, Yucca Valley, and 29 Palms, we also contract with a number of cities, specifically Adelanto, Fontana, Hesperia, who is in the annexation process with the county fire district right now, and then the city of Victorville. We also provide some county-wide services, specifically hazardous waste storage and waste monitoring and regulation, which is what we call CUPA. It's a state function. The history of the county fire district, we list 32 separate board-governed fire entities. Really, in reality, those were community service areas. I was hired in, as an example, to CSA 56, which is in Wrightwood. It was a parks and lighting district that also had fire powers. And so those were board-governed fire entities or areas that, but 32 separate ones. That goes back as long as I've been here and before. In 1988, we got together those 32 separate fire entities and said, can we pool our resources and pitch in on some overarching administrative services, fleet, administration, chief officers, payroll, and some of those things. That's commonly referred to as the fire agency, which existed for a short period of time. That led to a reorganization in 2008, LAFCO 3000 and 3001, which Ms. McDonald, Kathy McDonald from Rollins McDonald from LAFCO refers to as the hardest project of her life, was the county fire reorganization in 2008. That reorganized the county into a single fire district with 4 regional service zones and then 1 administrative overlay. We were reorganized under Fire Protection District Law of 1987, and those the sections of the Health and Safety Code, California Health and Safety Code, are listed before you. Interestingly, a part of the Health and Safety Code 13892 requires the fire districts to present a balanced budget annually. Real quickly, the map that you see in front of you is our service zones, and the colors that underlie those that map are the supervisorial districts. And as you can see, there are most of the supervisorial districts cover more than 1 service zone, and then there's one, Mr. Ramos, your district covers all the service zones from the supervisorial district. I just wanted to get into a little bit about our district revenue and how we're funded. As a fire district formed under fire district law, we are a taxing entity. We receive 46% of our revenue is property tax revenue. Interestingly enough, it's not one uniform percentage throughout the county. We have varying what we call percentages of the 1% that come to the fire district. Those were frozen at Prop 13 levels, and in some cases they're very low percentages, and in other cases they're relatively high percentages. The other revenue share is fees and assessments, and included in fees and assessments, we include service contracts with the cities that I mentioned earlier, and that would include even the MOU that we have before us with the county that's presented for you today. That also includes what you have often heard referred to as FPs, or fire protection tax areas, voter approved tax assessment areas, and what is also referred to as PM zones, or paramedic special or voter approved tax areas, and those range between currently $9 and $186 per parcel throughout the districts. Not all of the parcels have an assessment, and not all parcels generate property tax. For instance, in 29 Palms, part of the district, our entire funding comes from FP. There is no property tax revenue. The other 6% is bond revenue, as well as some grant revenue, 2% grant revenue and 4% bond proceeds. Financial accountability, we have an annual independent audit. In fact, just finished that over at district headquarters last week. We also are part of the LAFCO service review process that looks at the services we provide and really does focus in on some of the financial solvency and sustainability issues of the different districts within the county. And my understanding is that we are up for that this next year with LAFCO. And then we have our budgeting and finance is done in association with County Finance and Administration as well. A couple quotes that I found was interesting. I had been part of the fire district now for about 20 years, but started in 1992. And we're not bringing, I guess this slide is to demonstrate that we're not bringing really anything new to you today. We're reiterating some of the things that have been found. In fact, I did bring a pile of things here, but as I was going back even in the last couple weeks, looking at some old fire documents, I ran across a 1970 memo from Bob Rigney, County Administrative Officer Bob Rigney, that talked about his concerns about the county fire entity's ability to provide service in what we would typically refer to as the unfunded or underfunded areas throughout the county. In 2007, the LAFCO staff report talked about us facing this difference, this gap, as Ms. Smith referred to, in the delivery of services and the revenue needed to do that. Also talked about the inability for the district on its own to address capital improvement, station replacement, other capital improvement needs. The LAFCO reorganization was really spawned from an ESCI, Emergency Services Consulting Incorporated report that talked about a $83 million shortfall if not addressed. The LAFCO process, because of the combining of some administrative functions and budgeting processes, did, I would say, reduce that deficit of $83 million, but we'll talk in a little bit about what the projection we see moving forward in fire district funding. The next slide is a very, I would say, good representation of the gap that currently exists between what district revenues are and what the expenditures are. We went back to 2011. We went back that far because, quite frankly, that's when I started as the fire chief in 2011. Our expenses have grown and our revenues, as you can see, have grown, but that gap continues to grow. We have, to this point, that gap that you see between the roughly $250 million and the roughly 178 or so revenue has been filled by county general fund, specifically money to provide services or buy services in the areas that can't afford those services, and our fund balance and reserve accounts for the fire district. Yes, sir.
On this, I'm just looking from 2011 to 2015 or 16. It's roughly doubled the budget. Is that because of gathering up more and more areas primarily, or our actual cost has doubled?
Yeah, if you go back from 2011, the general fund went from purchasing about $8 million in services and programs to this past year, as Ms. Smith pointed out, about just under $26 million in services and programs.
I understand what we're backfilling.
Yes.
What I'm trying to find out, from the level of service in 2011 at $80 million roughly to 2017 at $200 million, that's a huge jump. And is that due primarily to the gathering of territories like San Bernardino and other cities? I mean, the expansion of the fire service, or just the actual cost has tripled?
It's a combination.
In 5 years. I mean, that's, and if it is tripled, what is most of that due to?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. We have gone from about a third of our revenue being property tax to almost half now, and that is due to the annexations that have taken place, starting in
And I'm not worried about
Crest
revenue, because I know
Yes.
we have to make the decision
Yes.
how to fill it up. I just
Yeah.
worry about the levels of service as it tripled in 5 years.
I don't think it has, sir. So these numbers are trending together. It's just that the delta, the difference
I
between.
understand the
Okay.
financial problem. I'm just, at the level of service, if I have a business that spends, 75 million a year, then I grow to 225 within 5 years, I'm trying to figure out where that growth is due to.
It's both. So I think we've expanded services in the way that you've described. We have annexations, but most of the annexations, were they previously covered by contract? So we've been providing those same services under contract and now annexation. So I don't know that we have a service expansion.
So, some of them are new services. The cities of Upland and San Bernardino, Crest Forest Fire Protection District, and 29 Palms are new services. The other ones were served under contract previously. But
So
I
it's
think
both.
your point is well taken, and that is the district is growing. And our budget, specifically from 2011 to this year, is significantly more.
Or even from 15 to 17, it's gone more than doubled, it looks like. And again, I was just trying to do that, is that 50% due to growth and 50% due more to our expenditures? Or
I think it's a combination. There are certain service areas, certain services that are being provided that had not been previously provided, and in point of fact, some of those are articulated in this MOU and are consumed by that $25 million that we were talking about. Some of it is expansions of service, but with those expansions of service has been some additional revenue. So that's why I know you're not asking the revenue question, but yes, it's both expansion of service and enhancement of services.
We can, we'll talk a little bit more about that slide and that gap. In fact, if you go to the next, as we go to the next slide, we look at that district funding gap. As I mentioned earlier, really we have maintained or improved services every year with the general fund support and or reserves and fund balance. We're at a point this next year where we do not have reserves or fund balance to augment the delivery of service. So that gap, if you will, is being filled less with reserves and fund balance and more with general fund. We will talk exactly where that general fund is going. But as you can see from 14 and 15, the general fund was paying for and, in fact, buying $19.2 million worth of programs and services. 2017-18 went up to 25, almost 26 million. And in that same period of time, our reserves and fund balance, not restricted reserves, but unrestricted reserves and fund balance has gone up a bit from 38 million to 40, and then down significantly to what we project to be $10.6 million at the end of this budget year. There were some, as you can see, and I want to make sure I point out, there were some large set-asides, specifically $12.5 million, that $8.2 million that you see, that drop-off in general fund support. That was the county taking a portion of the general fund support that they were giving us and putting it aside into a headquarters fund. And then we put another $8.5 million away out of our reserves and fund balance for that same account. Current distribution of the general fund, as you can see, Valley Service Zone, that isn't surprising. The areas that are better funded are not supported by the general fund. Those that have less funding and require more service have more general fund distribution going to them. And of course, the special operations that are shared by all of the service zones, a chunk of the general fund goes to that as well.
Chief, could we talk about this a little bit? Tell us what's in that fire special operations category.
Primarily, the special operations includes all of our training, our not all of our training, certain portions of our training funds, specifically our recruit training, accounts for about $1.5 million a year in recruit training. We also pay for our dozer and hand crew programs, primarily out of the fire administration. We take a portion of the money that goes to fire administration as well, and we purchase vehicles. So in 2011, we established a vehicle replacement plan, as opposed to coming to the board and saying that we need a few engines and crossing our fingers and hope that you'd give it to us. We created a comprehensive vehicle replacement strategy that we use some general fund support. And in fact, the county administrative office was very specific about making sure that some of that general fund support went to that newly formed replacement policy.
If I may, excuse me, Supervisor, but as part of the MOU, there is an exhibit, and the exhibit, with respect to this $5.5 million, articulates the specific purposes that are being covered for fire prevention background checks, staffing positions, the inmate hand crew, which the board approved, equipment replacement, emergency fuel, and then an undesignated amount of $198,532. And then, as the chief mentioned, 1.4 for the vehicle replacement.
Did either or both of you say all administrative costs, or those are split across the district and just some is picked up here?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So we spread much of the shared costs throughout the district, and then some of those we pick up at fire administration. So we have over the years shifted as much as we can out to the service zones, but as you can see, most of the service zones are unable to absorb those.
The Coupa category you mentioned earlier, is that also distributed, or is that in this operation?
Coupa is self-sustaining. We, in fees and assessments, we cover the costs for the Coupa responsibility throughout the state, mostly to businesses, in fact, specifically to businesses that generate and store hazardous waste.
County OES also, if I may just remark, County OES shows on here as part of the general fund allocation. That is a general government function. It is housed with county fire as a matter of administrative convenience to the county, but general fund allocations to support OES would continue to be recommended.
And that's really the core of what I'm trying to get at. Are there functions covered by general fund that we would all agree are legitimately general fund, and separate those out from the rest of this?
Yeah, and that's a good point, and I think Ms. Smith has pointed well to you on, and that was really the nature of the presentation, was to say, in exchange for the money you give us. I think when I first started, I'd hear a lot about, well, we subsidize. Really what the board does is look at what the communities that they serve need, and then they subsidize those communities with the amount of money. Somebody a long time ago decided that there probably ought to be a fire station in Fawnskin, or there ought to be a fire station in Lucerne Valley, or that it was advantageous to have a fire station in Wrightwood, and yet Spring Valley Lake was another one that I ran across in some old documents. Those stations, or those areas, as much as they need and rely on the uses of or the needs of a fire station and for fire rescue and EMS, they don't generate enough revenue, and that's really the basis of the issue that we have in front of you today.
How much of, and I'm assuming it's that North Desert service zone, how much of that is service to people traveling through our county rather than residents paying the taxes?
And that's an interesting point. We spotted in throughout those transportation corridors are small towns, and so like Baker, bless you, Bakerwood, for instance, that engine responds to a lot of the areas along the 15 and 40 corridor, but it also serves the town of Baker, and so in almost all those the area of Baker, the CSD of Baker, and a lot of those corridors, they have these small stops that much of our service occurs at as well. Like Ludlow, for instance, if you're traveling between Needles and Barstow, you're likely to stop at Ludlow for a soda pop. And what we found is if you have a medical issue, you typically don't stop along the side of the road, but you drive to the closest Baker or Ludlow, Barstow, or wherever else it might be. And so there are quite a few of our services in all of those areas that are dedicated to the travelers that go commute between Arizona and California, as well as Nevada and Arizona, not to mention the Mammoth or the Inyo-Mono County areas.
But it's pretty difficult for us to definitively separate out those charges.
No, we can actually show exactly the needs, no, but we can separate if the call happened as a result of a transportation issue, traffic collision, or if it was a medical response or a fire, a vehicle fire, or some other kind of, if I'm answering it correctly.
Did that answer your question, or was the question more whether, when we responded to that incident, was it an incident related to a traveler or a resident?
No, I think I understand now.
Thanks.
If I may, Mr. Chair? I will beg to disagree with you, Chief, in your last statement as you spoke to Supervisor Rutherford, saying that that it is our responsibility, or what we end up doing is subsidizing our communities that fall within our district. I disagree, because I believe that acting as the County Fire Protection District, and you as our fire chief, have the responsibility to come and tell us way in advance that there is a discrepancy, a serious financial discrepancy between what the district's revenue is and the actual service costs, so that we then together from the inception can be working on this as we get to looking at the budget as a whole. I know, if I remember correctly, 4, maybe 5 years ago, you were given direction to remove yourself from the general fund. We are here today still hearing, the same issues. None of these issues are new to me. And we have new supervisors on board, and we need to make some progress. I heard earlier you state or wanting to identify what the major costs incurred were. The one thing I did not hear was that as a result of contract negotiations, the wage and salaries that are agreed to, the retirement plans, the health plans, all of those cost money. And I'm not begrudging a penny of that. What I am begrudging is the negligence to address these issues up front and center. Our men and women in uniform deserve for us to speak openly about what the actual cost of keeping them in that uniform actually is. I believe we need to be forthright. We need to be very above board in this presentation. As I've stated before, I'm on my way out, and I want to be able to leave behind a balanced budget that has actuarials attached to it that will not continue to encumber future boards with $40 million. I've heard if we get down to brass tacks and we're looking at what it's going to look like next year, we're actually looking at some $40-odd million.
Yes,
Can't
ma'am.
do that.
And that's on the last slide. I have a couple more.
If I could jump in here for
Yes.
one moment, Supervisor. We agree, And part of, as I mentioned, part of the reason we're bringing this forward at this time is to allow that dialogue to take place and get direction from the board in terms of what your wishes are as we begin to prepare for next fiscal year's
Well, my
preparation.
wishes are
And also,
that, excuse me, my wishes are that when we make these items presentations, that we make them with clarity, that we don't sidestep the issues, because then if we do, then we're not making an actual presentation, we're repeating what's been done in years past. Thank you.
Thank you. And to also, when my response to Supervisor Hagman about what was comprising those cost differences, was it expansion of service or higher costs, and I said both. In that higher cost is just the cost per person, the cost per unit of service, and that goes to your point, ma'am, regarding wages and salary, pensions, and the other costs of doing business, which are also increasing.
You are correct. I would have expected that would have been said. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Just going to the next slide, where we actually get right into what that funding shortfall is, and that's really, in addition to making sure that we have a written document that formalizes the exchange of services for revenue, it's also, this presentation is also to demonstrate the fact that we do have a projected and significantly increasing shortfall in funding for especially the county areas from starting next year, roughly $43 million, running up into the 2022 budget year of about $68 million. This year, it's at $25 million. We used about $12 million out of our fund balance to cover some costs to do business this year. That won't be available next year. And in fact, as you recall on the slide previous, we were at $10 million on a general fund or a reserve fund, and we believe that we probably should not go lower than that $10 million. And then we've also included some projections for MOU and retirement increases from County Finance Administration.
And Chief, could I get you to go back a couple of slides to the slide that has the revenues and expenditures?
Yes.
One of the things that I failed to mention as we were talking about that gap is that the space between the red line and the blue line on this slide has two components to it. One component is the general fund allocation. And so part of the gap has been filled in years past, up until this year, by the general fund. Complementing that has been the use of reserves, as the chief alluded to. So on a year-to-year basis, if you add up the general fund allocation and the use of district reserves, it fills that gap. At this point, there's a large jump between this year and next year. In part, that is because the portion of the gap that has been filled by fund balance is no longer available. And so the entire gap is shifted or could shift to the general fund. But the gap is the gap. The means by which we have been filling it has been through a combination of general fund allocation and use of fund balance. And at this point, fund balance is no longer an available option. I just wanted to clarify that.
We go straight into a financing option. So we've gone from the funding shortfall into kind of where we go from here. The fire district law is very specific in stating that the district board, determine the amount of revenue for the coming fiscal year. If you do, will be inadequate. And quite frankly, every time that you allocate general fund revenue, you have made the decision that the revenue generated by the district is inadequate. You meet the amount of expenditures needed to protect life and property through the process of raising revenue or reducing services. And you've raised revenue to this point with the general fund support, essentially. And I've listed those, broken those down specifically as they relate to the county fire district. And that would be a continued reliance on county general fund support, as you see in the MOU before you today. You could reduce services to match the district revenue, which is quite frankly what the Health and Safety Code requires, or you could raise district revenue, and the Health and Safety Code has options as well for raising district revenue. The revenue, if you were to go that direction on revenue enhancements or raising revenue, fire district law allows the district to levy an assessment for fire suppression services, in our legal opinion from our legal counsel, that would require a 2/3 vote of the public. Another option is to expand the use of an existing service zone, which is 13,950. 50 is the creation of one, and 51 is the expansion of one. Would allow you to expand an existing service zone to maintain or improve services throughout the county.
And in this case, the reference to the service zone is not to the physical zone, but to the FP or PM assessment.
That's correct. The summary, just before we get into some more questions perhaps, I just wanted to make it very clear, fire district revenues have never been sufficient to fully fund fire services in the county. As I look back at the board's interest in providing an adequate, in fact, in many cases, a minimum level of fire services in very outlying areas, the county has found ways to pitch in money to buy those services out of some general fund support. The gap between the revenues and expenses since I've been here in 2011 continues to widen, and in fact was widening before I got here. As you referred to, Supervisor Gonzalez, the gap is estimated to be $43.7 million next year, up from the a little under $26 million this year. And that would be to maintain services. That would not be to improve services or enhancement of services that I might ask for from our fire board coming next year. And then that gap grows just in some basic MOU and retirement calculations from finance administration would grow to almost just a little over $67 million in the 2022 budget year. What I'd like you to consider, at least today, and I think I've been very clear with my staff and with the CEO that more than anything, I want to make sure we don't get to January or February of next year and start talking about budget issues for next year. And you look surprised that in order to maintain the exact level of service that we have today, not improvement of services, but to maintain those services, it would not be $25 million and change that it is this year. It would be I'll be asking for $43 million and change. Again, that'll have something to do with what our actuals come in at, but that's a pretty good projection for next year. The options, of course, is we can continue to rely on an increasing amount of the general fund, which we have over the past years. In fact, the 6 years that I've been here, you could look at reducing services, and I know that's not an option that any one of you look towards in any budget year, or we could look at to increase district revenues. And that takes me to the end of my presentation, and I'm available along with members of my staff and budget and finance team.
I'd like to add also that another element of that, the spike between 17, 18, and 18, 19, because it is a fairly substantial jump, that incorporates a recommendation from our office that additional funds be set aside to start rebuilding their fund balance. So embedded in that is our expectation that incrementally over the next several years, they will have additional money set aside in their fund balance to achieve a level that we think is more appropriate given the size of their annual budget at $250 million.
And that is incorporated not for next budget year. The $43 million that we anticipate would not include that. That would be, but those are built into subsequent years after what is projected in the next budget year. Yes, that's a good point.
No, Supervisor Ramos.
Yeah, on the slide that showed the district funding gap,
The graph or the,
not the graph, the numbers.
okay.
Yeah, there.
Yes, sir.
So the district funding gap is a component of the overall budget. So what is the actual total budget, and what is the percentage of the actual general fund support that's going to the total budget of, in some cases, over 175 million? So I think if you could get those numbers for me, or explain that a little bit to me. Of where
Well,
that
it's roughly
fits in
20,
the whole budget.
it's roughly 25 million of a roughly $250 million budget. So if we look at that year at 10%, you're 25, 12, you're under 10% of the overall budget,
So
essentially.
under 10% is basically about 10% is where the general fund is coming in to fill that gap funding. So the overall budget is large, and you're getting funding for that, some revenue, but the short gap fluctuates between 10% to 15% of the total budget, or do we know?
Currently,
Or do we know?
we know what we're very clear on what the general fund support is. We know what our overall budget is, so we can tell you exactly what the proportion is. I think there's always been concern in the past, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question about what those funds buy. In other words, what
No,
does that
my
go to?
question is specific financial calculations. You have
If I may,
100%
Supervisor?
of a budget.
The 100% of the county fire budget is 248 or $250 million, of which about 25 million is provided this year, for the current fiscal year, about 25 million. So it is roughly 10%. It might be slightly above or below. And for years past, I don't have fire's budget number in front of me to do that math for the prior general fund allocations.
Okay, but it's safe to say that it's under
Around there.
20% of the total budget throughout the years that we're actually been looking at the general fund to fund the gap between the revenue and expenses.
Yes, sir. When I started in 2011, you approved $12 million. We were roughly $148 million budget that first year that I came. So it was just under 10% that year as well. And it has maintained very close to that amount.
I just wanted to be clear, and going on the same lines as Supervisor Gonzalez, is just being clear to everyone, the dialogue that's happening, and for myself to be clear that what we're talking about, the 19.8.2, the 21.7, 25.8, is not the total budget of the fire district. The total budget is in excess of 250 million. So when you put that 250 million to the district fund gap funding from the general fund, we see that the majority of it, and in this case 10%, is what we're actually doing to help that move forward. And I also have questions too, as far as Supervisor Rutherford brought, and I believe brought to the discussion, as far as what is the actual responsibility of the fire district, and what are some of the cost of maybe the enhanced services that could be engaged in some of this gap funding that's there. And as long as we truly understand what it is, and we believe that it is better serving our constituents for public safety, then we go ahead and vote on those issues, like we're looking at this MOU today, clearly spelled out on what X, Y, and Z is. So I think looking at that and seeing the gap funding and knowing that the overall budget is 250 million, and we're looking at a component to fill in, what is in that component that we're asking to fill in, or even going back and look at the overall budget to find out what is the true responsibility versus some of the enhanced components that could be causing some of the escalating costs that are there. So we're truly discussing all the parameters and comparing them equally.
Yes, sir. And to your point, we know this last budget year, for instance, we increased the staffing in Fonskin. We went from 2 people to 3 people. We did that in Baker. We did that in San Antonio Heights. So there has been an improvement, what we would say an improvement in the level of service. One of the conversations I had with Ms. McDonald when I came in was, why is it the county responsibility to provide service along I-40, for instance, outside of Barstow? just for instance, if Barstow was the closest fire district to that, or if why would we have the responsibility to provide service along the 395 if there was another provider that was closer to do that? At this point, when we were reorganized, the county fire district was encompassed then and encompasses today over 19,000 square miles, which is our service area.
No, thank you, and thank you for that clarification on that. I just wanted to bring
Yes, sir.
into context for my own thinking where it really lies into the overall budget.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Supervisor Reynolds. Supervisor Hagman?
Thank you, and some of my questions answered. I still do not fully get well, it's part of both. I understand it's part of both. I understand the revenues come from different places, but there is a substantial jump in budgeting. And so just on my office of my own, love to see where from, the last 5 to 10 years have we've gone, is it due to levels of service or actually cost of personnel or cost of, where's those big jumps? Because it's quite a bit. It's not 20%, whatever, it's 100% plus jumps. And then also, how are some of the other counties dealing with some of these same issues? Granted, they don't have the vast geographic areas that we have, but they probably have some of the same things. What are some of the tools in their toolboxes to make up some of the differences? The difference between a public safety and a fire versus public safety and a sheriff is we can tax with you, we can't with them at this point. How are other counties dealing with it? Are they always supplementing as, 50 out of the 58 counties supplement general funds? Are they doing, and then lastly also, are they providing the same manpower services? You talked about increasing manpower from 2 to 3 in some of these engines and stuff like that. You definitely know your business, how much we're staffing for medical versus fire and in those type of areas and, what kind of organization is, because it does look like it's really, the gap is growing very greatly. I do see the urgency for us this year to make changes, but I want to be as well informed as possible to how we got here, and then where we plan from that point going forward. Sometimes if it's a lot due to pension costs, some of those bubbles occur, and then or like in some of the things we're dealing with our current budget, we've been having to catch up with pensions, and we're almost there. So maybe some of those things are leveling out going forward, and so I just want to be a clear understanding of the financials of that.
There are two types of county fire departments throughout the state. There are what we refer to as general fund departments, and then there are board-governed fire districts that are county fire districts. Most of the fire districts, in fact, I have yet to find one fire district that receives general fund support into the district. However, where the property taxes go straight to the county general fund, those, of course, get a substantial portion of general fund revenue and then are into the budget fight, if you will, with all the other departments. Yes, sir.
So our chart here goes back to 11-12 with general fund support. Do you have any idea, just a rough guesstimate, of how long general fund's been providing funding for the district?
We go back to 1999. It was $900,000 in 1999. We believe that was the first allocation came as kind of a compromise with the fire district in 172. If you remember, 172 revenue, half-cent sales tax started producing public safety revenue throughout the county. The county fire district was not included in that distribution or that calculation. My understanding is that first $800,000 or $900,000 allocation, formal allocation, came from kind of a discussion between the organization, and I wasn't part of that discussion, but that's my understanding.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, one more follow-up. In that kind of study for me, I know most of my West End cities have independent fire districts. Some of them are a lot of them are independently, they're very independent, but they also get their own property tax allocation on top of that. And just as far as our member cities, are there part of the 1% or the percentage of the 1% the cities get, or are they a standalone separate tax, and those would be helpful as well? And what rate are those?
Yeah, those vary anywhere between I've seen it 15% on the West End all the way up to 23% in the city of Fontana, for instance. That was frozen at Prop 13 levels. I will tell you, though, that most of the solvent sustainable fire districts, as I do more work or interaction with departments throughout the state and fire districts throughout the state that are healthy, are either come from very high-valued property areas, generally just a lot of revenue coming from property taxes, and or specifically in the district that I live in, it's a combination of, I would say, very good property tax revenue, in addition, community facility districts or special tax areas. And so I would say most districts, long-term sustainable districts, actually don't rely on just one, or if they do rely on one, they're very wealthy, specifically, or high-valued property areas to start with, and that wouldn't typically be us county-wide. We do have, of course, some areas within the county that are that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone? Any other comments? Josie?
Thank you. Wanted to ask if there has ever been an assessment of the different zones, if you will, in regards to what percentage is Prop 13 versus not, and then comparing it to the actual cost of delivering services that then would give an indication of where work needed to be done as far as communicating to those property owners that in fact are enjoying a benefit because of Prop 13 that then allows them the same level of fire protection services as their next door neighbor who may not be under Prop 13, and that neighbor is paying a full ticket here, and somehow out in the blue yonder, you are charged with trying to make everything, the horizon or the sunset, whichever time of day it is, making it all look even. Has anything like that been done, and when was the last time?
Yeah, so we do that regularly, not because we have to, because as a service zone, we can take the tax revenue generated with the entire service zone, and that was one of the benefits of the reorganization. We didn't have to take those 32 separate budgets and say, if it's generated in Muscoy, it's got to be spent in Muscoy. Now, if it's generated in Muscoy, for instance, in your area, it can be spent, it's spent in the entire, we look at the risk to Muscoy, the revenue from the entire service zone, and where are our resources best spent. Some of the same conversations we have with neighboring districts. Hey, let's take what you have, let's see what you have, let's see what we have, and let's see if we can get together and spend it more wisely. I will tell you that as we look at, for instance, I'll use a valley area, Bloomington, you would say, what's the difference between Bloomington, the community of Bloomington, and the community of Muscoy? A lot of that has to do with both the property tax share, essentially that percentage of the 1%, and then how many properties are contributing the property taxes to that area. Bloomington, for instance, generates enough property taxes to pay for the service in Bloomington out of the fire station there on Valley Boulevard, right off of Valley in Bloomington. Muscoy, for instance, does not. Muscoy has a fire station there, but does not generate as a function of the number of parcels that are contributing and the property tax rate does not contribute enough, and so we take property tax revenue that's generated within the valley and we provide service there, for instance.
Correct. And then another factor to include is the number of calls for service and the amount of population growth that has taken place, because it's people that generate the calls, not the number of parcels, and consequently we have a radical mix, if you will, in that formula. So is that something that should have been included here? I would have liked to have seen that included here, because if you have the current distribution of general fund by zones on this page, then it would seem to me that the difference would also be in there, the population growth, and as I said, the Prop 13 is a great inhibitor to what we're discussing here. And there are those individuals that will have built-in benefits because of that proposition, and others will not.
Yeah, that is one of the conversations we have with our partner agencies. When we're separate, we build stations and we provide staffing based on what our responsibility is in our district. The nice part, for instance, in some of the areas that we use county resources for, and in the city, and the city resources for in the county, is now we're saying if we're all part of the same district, maybe the distribution of stations is different. But you look at a place like Lucerne Valley, which is a great example. They're only running about a little over two, averaging about 2 calls a day. You wouldn't build a station for 2 calls a day if it wasn't separated by 25 miles from the closest fire station. So part of it isn't just the number of calls that determines the need for a station, the number of it's the fact that they need something at all. And Baker's a good example. The community of Baker doesn't generate enough call volume for a station in Baker, but you wouldn't want to wait more than an hour and a half, or 2 hours for service. And so that's where you as a board or your predecessors have made the decision, we need to have something, even though Spring Valley Lake doesn't generate enough revenue for a station, we need to have service in Spring Valley Lake. But since Spring Valley Lake is separate, the county, from Hesperia and Victorville, we didn't get together in a countywide plan, fire protection plan, and figure out, hey, how could we pool our resources? Those conversations are happening now, not just in San Bernardino County. Statewide, neighbors are sitting down with neighbors and saying, hey, instead of us building a new station or instead of hiring a new person for this, can we share that cost by pooling our resources and our capabilities? And so if that answers your question, it's not just call volume, it's of course just the need in some of those outlying areas.
No, you're correct. You took it exactly where I wanted to go. It is that neighbor-to-neighbor communication. It is that agency-to-neighbor communication that we need, that will ultimately allow us to move forward at some point to be able to share with the taxpayer what that the subsidy that has been taking place and the increase in that subsidy in the future if we do not address this in very direct fashion. And ultimately, it is my opinion that the taxpayers need to be made aware that there are projects, there are improvements that we as a county are not making to the quality of their lives because of the subsidy that we are making year after year for fire protection services that ultimately, in my opinion, should be on the taxpayer. Obviously, if my colleagues feel that continuing with the subsidy is something they want to support, hey, I get it. But I think that we need to be very above board, very open. We have an opportunity here before this really burgeons out of control. And by this, I mean the amount of subsidy that we are able to justifiably say, look, these are the actual costs, and we want to be there and respond for every emergency call that comes in. But unfortunately, unless every taxpayer, every property owner carries an equal amount of responsibility, then there is going to be a disparity between those that pay more than their fair share and those that don't come close to paying their share. And I think, to me, that is the biggest question that we're looking at, not how much. That is another conversation. For me, this is about closing that gap, closing it with rational and very factual numbers.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Supervisor Gonzalez. Janice.
Supervisor Gonzalez, I hear your concerns, but I don't think Prop 13 is the enemy here, and I don't think it's uniquely created this situation. Prop 13 applies to all property owners across the state of California and contributes to every agency and every program that we fund. It's not unique to the fire district. And even if you wanted to conclude that it's the main reason for this problem, it's nothing that this board controls. It is a constitutional amendment approved by the people of this state, and we're not going to mess with it.
No, you're,
So-
you're correct, and I'm not faulting it at all. I'm identifying it as a contributing reason. That's all I'm doing. I don't have I love Prop 13. You know, I'm beneficiary. At some point, you know, if we're blessed enough and we inherit some property, Prop 13 is awesome. Fact is that because of its presence in many or all, I would say, revenue-generating taxable situations, it is an element of consideration. That's all I'm doing.
I think from here, the conversation that we've got to have is how much we want to look at the options that you've presented us, or if there are any more out there. And I'm interested in getting information about all of them so that we can make a fully informed decision. But it seems to me that we need to specifically have very specific details on potential service reductions that we can take out to the communities we represent and let them know that this is the reality of what the budget situation is dictating. I think it's also reasonable, as my questions indicated before, that there is going to be general funding of the fire district. And, maybe someday if the county wins the lottery, that won't be the case. But I think it's a necessity and it's a reality that we have to accept. The question for my colleagues and I is at what level, and that's why I was trying to get those details from you. But I'm not one at this point to say we have to get you out of the general fund completely. There's an appropriate place for general fund support of our fire and emergency services. We just have to figure out where that right line is.
Thank you, Janice. Any other comments? Supervisor Ramos.
Yeah, just real quick. I know in the summary it does talk about options for consideration. One is continued general fund support and then increased district revenues. It does mention service reductions, but I just want to be clear that I'm in no way looking at service reductions being the supervisor that incorporates all of the different zones. I'd rather have a solution to it to be able to maintain the services that we are providing the residents of San Bernardino County and look at the enhancements when they come back to that gap funding. And again, if it is something this board believes is something that complements that, then the board would be able to vote on that. But at this point, I'm more in favor of going out and looking at some of those increased district revenues options, not so much ready to talk about service reductions at this point. And again, being the supervisor that has all four of these zones in there, I'm standing up for the constituents saying let's maintain the level of service that we have.
Yeah, Supervisor, I think I do need to share with you that we do have very large areas of the county today that don't have. There's a 100-mile separation between fire stations on the I-40 corridor. We have no staffing, full-time staffing of any resources along the river, Colorado River corridor on the California side, from Havasu Landing all the way down to Big River. We have areas of I-15 and 395 leading up into Mammoth that we cross our fingers, quite frankly, and hope that we can get aid from either an ambulance company or another fire district. And so I appreciate that, because I'm going to come to you next year and ask for service improvements, because I believe that we're at no point now at a time in the district's history to even propose service reductions, and yet I understand that it's a very real conversation, because without money, we have to look at, by fire district law, we have to look at reducing services.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that. And again, the increased district revenues and looking at the options that are there, and not even bringing up the topic of service.
Supervisor Gonzalez.
On that note, I'd like to ask, how would areas that want extra services pay for them in the future?
That's a good question. To this point, in fact, we do have it started, it didn't start there, but one of the most successful fire protection areas we have, or zones that we have, is the community of Oro Grande, sometimes referred to as Silver Lakes or Helendale. And that was a community, in fact, there's 10 of those communities throughout the county who came to us and said, we know what our property taxes generate, and we know the services that provides. We believe you. However, we want to have this level of service. For instance, in Lake Arrowhead, it was we want to have paramedics on our fire engines, and if we can help support an ambulance service. How much would that cost us? We want a fire engine with 3 people on it so that you can enter a burning building, or you could do a progressive hose lay for wildland. How much will that cost us? We took a look at those properties long before I was here, because quite frankly, some of those 10 districts do not generate enough revenue to provide the services we even promised. So I'm not sure exactly how that calculation was done. Sometimes they were done using part-time firefighters, and then you're dependent on a part-time workforce in the community, which wasn't, I don't think, a wise way of doing it. But one area that was successful is with Helendale. They said, we want 3 full-time people on the fire engine. What does that cost? We took the number of parcels that were available in that area. We divided that by the cost divided by the number of parcels, and we came up with a parcel tax currently at about $150. That's what you hear to as FP5. So one of the ways we do that throughout the county is we present those options to the community, and they, through a vote of that community, tax themselves in order to pay for the services enhancements in those communities. Yes, ma'am.
Very good, thank you.
All right, any further questions, comments? Okay, I'm going to finish with 4 real quick, Chief, and I'll do that, and then we have one request for a public speaker. And this is, Mr. Besley, this is a receipt and file, correct, today? Well, it'll be an
actually,
action.
there's a portion of this to approve the MOU.
Yes.
As
all
far
right,
as
so
as far as the chief's report is concerned, though, it was just a presentation, and if the board could
correct.
give us direction.
And then we'll have a vote on the MOU.
Yes.
So, Chief, 4 things real quick. Is first thing, when we go back to the gap lines, I think all my peers brought that up between the two. The red and the blue is kind of get a breakdown of that. And when I say that, so how much is it are really going to be moving forward of our future retirement cost? That's a bubble at some point. That's a bell curve that's going to rapidly start going down. What's it going to be? What's its impact 5-10 years out? I would like to see that. When we're looking at reserves amount, I'd kind of like to know, again, get a stated policy on that. You know, are we going to have requests 10, 20, 30% of reserves? And if 4, someone's going to have to at least share with me where the collapse is going to come. That's going to, when we have 100 million, 150 million, why is it sitting there year after year? Before that request moves forward. The next one we want to look at is I want to get a breakdown, especially in the 1st district with the PM and the PFs, so that I understand those throughout the district completely.
I'm sorry, when you say the
PMs, and so you have the paramedic. And so if we go back to the original gap of the 9 to 150 current assessment fees that we're going, I want to see a punch map on that. We're collecting these dollars from this bucket, this dollar from here, based on the presentation. If we go back to one of the first slides. And then, you know, why are we at a point of depleting funds and not continuing to add funds in the time when I say that? Because I know the fund balance, we're showing that we're going to deplete it. What's been held back in reserves, and during the times of this upswing, why haven't we been adding to it for the past 4 years? Versus saying, hey, now we got a crisis. Wait a minute, we're going to have to really accelerate this next. We should have been continuing to add in my mind. But anyway, those are the things we'll have a side conversation. That's my last comment. I appreciate for the presentation. Without any further comment from my board members, Chief, I do thank you that. I'm going to ask for a motion on the MOU. No? Oh, I'm sorry. We do have one public speaker. I got way in front of myself. Getting close to lunchtime. Sorry about that, folks. Mr. Lindbergh, I'm going to assume? No. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jim Grigoli.
Hello, Board. I don't get to speak to you often at this end, so I wanted to come to address. I appreciate Chief Hartwig's presentation, and from the men and women of the County Fire Department, I cannot urge you enough to accept this MOU, but to also discuss with you some of our future of what it holds for us. Really quick. Supervisor Hagman, on your question, the 15 to 17, you have to remember when Chief Hartwig came in, we were trying to correct our staffing models to be like the others, the other communities that we have. And we had people, 1 person on a fire engine and 2 people on a fire engine. We've now corrected that staffing model, and besides the intaking of some of the other cities, but that was also also part of the growth there. And Supervisor Rutherford, just for a correction on 172, when we started back in the late 90s, you'll remember our previous president, Darrell Crane, Supervisor Rutherford and Supervisor Gonzalez. He had come to you with a presentation way back then, and I believe right around then it was about $90 million, $95 million the board was getting for 172 money, and asked you at that time for a portion of the 172 money that was designed to go to police and fire. He had asked you for a portion of that, and it never got approved, so the county fire department continues to get zero. But today, the 172 money is at about $174 million, which would have probably solved this crisis that we're in today, or certainly have helped. One last thing, we faced this same crisis at the end of this, or at this last budget year, where we turned around and the board had to make special allocations to continue our hand crew program and our fire station out in Wonder Valley, and we truly appreciate that from the members of Local 935. These are reality things that we're facing every year, and they will continue to go. Our call volume continues to grow dramatically, not only in San Bernardino City, but all over our county areas, and we urge the board to consider a stable funding source for us that will have a growing mechanism that we can keep up the service levels that we provide. And certainly cuts in our service can just not simply be an option. Like the chief said, we still have many areas to fix in this county to provide an adequate service to our citizens, and I urge the board to consider that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gugoli. And that concludes, and I did not get the folder handed to me in time, so apologize ahead. With that, that finishes our public comment. I'm going to bring it back to the board for a motion. Oh, you have a comment?
Questions?
Yep.
Okay. I thought we were going to look to give direction as to what it was that we are looking at in regards to revenue generating measures for the district. That was one. And the other, I was hoping that we would be able to give direction as to identifying what county services should be subsidized by the general fund and which ones we would not want to be subsidized by the general fund.
My understanding is we had the presentation today by the chief, and we're going to need to move on the MOU to move forward, that we were not going to go through the process, I think, of picking and choosing what services we were going to continue or to, other than move forward. And Dino, please.
So my interest was in getting some direction from the board to inform our discussions and processes moving forward, especially as we come up on the preparations for the next fiscal year. What I've gotten today are some questions, requests for additional information, which I am sensing is information the board would like to have before taking this discussion any further. That if the board's desire is other than that, and you have specific direction for us in terms of researching any of these options beyond the information requests, we're happy to hear those today.
I myself would very much like to have those revenue generating opportunities and discussions. I know that whatever is decided here will impact 2018 and 19. It'll either move it forward, keep it the same, or set us back. I'm wanting to be able to, as I said, get clarity as to what comes out of this item today that clearly sets that direction for next year and the year after that.
Supervisor Ramos.
My question is, County Council, this item is on the agenda as 42. Item 1, receive report regarding San Bernardino County Fire Protection District financing, and then item 2 and 3 are the reverse orders of the MOU and accepting those. If in the report that's coming forward to us, and at the end of that report says options for consideration, if one of those considerations is a motion is made, that's clearly within the dialogue and the authority we have because the item has been on the agenda.
It is
Okay.
to give, the possibility is to give direction.
Give direction to go
as
back
far as
on a
one of
specific
those
item that
options
has been reported
that's-
within the report given to us.
Exactly.
All right, so, Mr. Chair, if I could try at crafting a motion in hopes of getting more information, is that I would like to make a motion, 1, to move forward and to gather information on the increased district revenues that was presented to us and have staff directed to gather that information and bring that back to the board. That's one motion.
Okay, now, and are we going to break this, John?
Yeah,
and
then next,
okay.
I'll do the MOU.
Okay. So I have that as a motion. It's second by Supervisor Hagman. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, Carrie. Next motion we'll move to is then really think that concludes that unanimously. We go to the a motion for the MOU.
Thank you. And I'd like to make a motion for item 2 to move forward with the MOU of the county, San Bernardino County, and approve a memorandum of understanding with the San Bernardino County Fire Protection District.
I have a motion. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hagman. All in favor?
Aye.
Carries unanimously. Chief, thank you for the presentation, and I will conclude with, no.
Yeah.
There's third.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And item 3, Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion to approve the MOU with the San Bernardino County Fire Protection District and the San Bernardino County Governing Board.
Have a second by Hagman. All in favor?
Aye.
Carry unanimously. So with that, and Ms. Smith, I would say that let's set our agendas to come back with the questions that have been answered, possibly a workshop to really kind of review and thoroughly bring back to the board, because one thing I have heard from each member today, there were a multitude of questions, and we have not yet received those answers, so we look forward to having a workshop with this as we move forward, Chief. Thank you very much.